The rain didn't just fall. It felt like a barrage of frozen glass slicing through the midnight darkness of the Catskills. Leora's fingers, numb and slick with warm arterial blood, gripped the collar of a $3,000 bespoke suit, dragging the bleeding air of the most feared syndicate in the Northeast through the suffocating mud. Every violent crack of thunder masked the sound of his ragged, shallow breathing. If she left him in the mud, he would die before the storm broke. If she saved him, her quiet, invisible life as a maid was over. Blood on her uniform, a dying Mafia prince in her arms. There was no going back. The Blackwood estate was designed to be a fortress, disguised as a luxury retreat. Nestled deep in the heavily forested mountains of upstate New York, it belonged to the Moretti family, a name whispered with a mixture of reverence and absolute terror in the underground circles of the eastern seaboard. Leora Higgins didn't care about the whispers. She cared about the $22 an hour she made, scrubbing imported Italian marble and dusting 19th-century chandeliers. She cared about the mounting pile of medical bills sitting on her kitchen counter, back in a cramped Albany apartment, waiting to drown her and her younger sister, Sophie. It was 11:42 p.m. The nor'easter had slammed into the mountains 2 hours earlier, a brutal tempest of driving rain and howling winds that tore branches from the ancient pines and whipped them against the reinforced glass windows of the estate. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, had dismissed the rest of the staff before the roads became impassable. Leora, needing the overtime, had volunteered to stay behind and lock up the west wing. The estate was completely silent, save for the raging storm outside. Leora was on her knees in the grand foyer, buffing a stubborn scuff mark out of the checkered marble floor, when the heavy oak front doors imploded. The sound was deafening, a violent crash of splintering wood and shattered iron locks that echoed like a cannon shot through the cavernous hall. The wind shrieked into the foyer, bringing with it a torrent of freezing rain and dead leaves. Leora scrambled backward, her heart slamming against her ribs, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by a blinding flash of lightning, was a man. He didn't walk, he stumbled forward, a broken puppet with its strings severed. He took 2 agonizing steps into the foyer before his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the pristine marble with a sickening thud, a dark, viscous pool immediately beginning to spread out from beneath him, stark and terrifying against the white stone. Leora froze, the polishing rag slipping from her trembling fingers. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to hide in the servant quarters and lock the heavy steel door. This was the Moretti estate. Violence was baked into the very foundation of the house, even if she had spent the last 8 months pretending it wasn't. But as she stared at the figure on the floor, a low, agonizing groan escaped his lips. She forced herself to move, crawling across the floor until she was kneeling beside him. It was Leo Moretti. She had only seen him twice in passing, a towering, sharply handsome man with cold, calculating dark eyes and an aura of arrogant authority. Now the heir to the Moretti Empire was unrecognizable. His custom charcoal suit was shredded, saturated with rainwater and blood. His face was ghostly pale, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. 2 gunshot wounds painted his body, one high on his left shoulder, cleanly piercing the muscle, and a far more terrifying one in his lower right abdomen, pulsing with dark, rhythmic spurts of blood. "Mr. Moretti," Leora gasped, her hands hovering uselessly over his ruined body. His eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. He grabbed her wrist with a grip that was shockingly strong, his fingers leaving bloody smears on her pale skin. They breached the gate," he choked out, blood bubbling at the corner of his lips. Samuel sold us out. They're coming up the mountain." Leora's blood ran cold. Samuel Reed was the head of the Blackwood Estate's security. If he was the one orchestrating this, the entire perimeter was compromised. There were no guards coming to save them. The local police were 50 miles away and owned by the Morettis anyway. They were completely, utterly alone. "I need to call an ambulance," Leora said, her voice shaking as she reached for the radio, clipped to her apron. Leo's hand snapped out, knocking the radio away. It clattered across the marble. "No!" he hissed, his eyes suddenly burning with a feral intensity. "No cops, no radios. They're monitoring the frequencies. You call, they pinpoint my location. They finish the job. You're bleeding to death." Leora yelled over the sound of the wind tearing through the open doors. "Listen to me," Leo commanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate rasp. "If they find me in this house, they will kill me, and they will kill you for seeing their faces. We have to leave." "Leave? In this?" Leora gestured wildly towards the apocalyptic storm raging outside. "You can't even stand." "The old groundskeeper's cabin," Leo muttered, his eyelids drooping. "Half a mile north, through the woods, old hunting trails. They don't know about it. Take me there." He passed out, his head slumping heavily against the floor. Leora stared at him. She could run. She knew the service tunnels beneath the estate. She could slip away into the night, find her rusted Honda Civic, hidden in the lower staff garage, and take her chances on the flooded mountain roads. She owed this man nothing. His family dealt in blood and shadows. They brought this violence upon themselves. But as she looked at his pale, lifeless face, she thought of Sophie. She thought of the helplessness of watching someone you love fade away in a sterile hospital bed while the world kept turning. She couldn't leave a man to be butchered on the floor she had just spent an hour polishing. "Damn it," Leora whispered. She grabbed the collar of his ruined suit jacket and heaved. Getting Leo Moretti out of the house was a masterclass in agony. He was easily 6'2" and built like a middleweight boxer, pure, dense muscle deadweight. Leora, standing barely 5'4", felt her spine protest as she dragged him out of the shattered front doors and into the teeth of the storm. The moment they crossed the threshold, the elements assaulted them. The rain was like ice needles against her face, blinding her. The mud in the manicured gardens instantly swallowed her cheap, slip-resistant work shoes. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. She had slung his uninjured right arm over her shoulder, acting as a human crutch, half carrying, half dragging him towards the dense, imposing tree line of the Catskill woods. "Wake up!" she screamed over the roaring wind, shaking him roughly. "I need you to walk. I can't carry you." Leo groaned, his boots dragging through the thick sludge. He forced his eyes open, squinting against the deluge. The shock of the freezing rain seemed to bring a momentary surge of adrenaline to his system. He leaned heavily against her, his breath hot and ragged against her ear. "Keep right. At the stone wall," he slurred. They plunged into the forest. The canopy of ancient oaks and pines offered a slight reprieve from the driving rain, but the ground was infinitely worse. Exposed roots, slick with moss, jagged rocks, and thick underbrush turned the forest floor into an obstacle course. Leora's uniform was soaked through, the thin cotton offering zero protection against the plunging temperature. Her muscles screamed in protest, her lungs burning as she dragged the Mafia air deeper into the darkness. "Why?" Leo breathed heavily, his head lolling against her shoulder. "Why are you doing this? You're a maid." "Because I'm paid to clean up messes," Leora grunted, shoving a wet branch out of their path. "And right now, you're making a massive mess on my shift." Despite the blood loss and the agonizing pain, a weak, cynical huff of laughter escaped Leo's chest. "What's your name?" "Leora." "Leora," he repeated, tasting the name. "If we live through this, I'm giving you a raise." "If we live through this, I'm quitting," she snapped back. Suddenly, the distinct sound of high-powered engines cut through the roar of the storm. Leora froze, dragging Leo behind the massive trunk of a fallen redwood. Down the mountain, near the main gates of the estate, beams of bright white halogen light sliced through the rain. 3 matte black SUVs were tearing up the winding driveway towards the main house. "Samuel's men," Leo whispered, his voice dangerously weak. "The cleanup crew." Leora watched as heavily armed men piled out of the vehicles, their tactical flashlights cutting through the darkness like predatory eyes. They swarmed the shattered front doors of the estate. It would only take them a few minutes to find the massive pool of blood on the marble and track the smear of it leading out into the mud. "We have to go faster," Leora said, panic finally wrapping its cold hands around her throat. She hoisted him up again. The next 20 minutes were a blur of sheer, desperate endurance. Leora lost her right shoe to a sinkhole of mud, but didn't stop. Her foot bled, cut by sharp stones, but the adrenaline masked the pain. She was operating on pure survival instinct. Every time Leo's knees buckled, she hauled him back up by the lapels of his ruined suit, shouting at him, keeping him tethered to consciousness by sheer force of will. Finally, a shadow darker than the trees emerged in the gloom. The groundskeeper's cabin. It was an old, dilapidated structure built from rough-hewn logs, long abandoned by the Moretti family and overgrown with aggressive ivy. Leora practically kicked the rotted wooden door open and dragged Leo inside, kicking it shut behind them. The interior smelled of dust, mold, and old wood ash. It was pitch black, but it was dry, and the wind was reduced to a dull roar against the thick timber walls. She lowered Leo to the dusty floorboards. He was completely unresponsive now, his breathing terribly shallow. "Hey!" Leora slapped his cheek, her hands slick with his blood. "Leo, do not die on me now. Do you hear me? I didn't lose my favorite shoe to drag a corpse through the woods." Silence. Leora scrambled around the dark cabin, her hands blindly searching the walls and shelves. Her fingers brushed against a heavy metal cylinder, a vintage kerosene storm lantern. Beside it, a half-used box of matches. With trembling hands, she struck a match. The small flame flared, illuminating the cramped, forgotten space. She lit the lantern, and a warm, golden glow pushed back the shadows. She turned the light onto Leo. The sight made her stomach heave. The blood loss was catastrophic. The wound in his abdomen was steadily weeping dark blood, soaking his trousers and the floorboards beneath him. If she didn't stop the bleeding in the next 5 minutes, the heir to the Moretti Empire would bleed out on a rotting floor, and she would be found standing over his corpse by the men hunting him. Leora stripped off her soaked, muddy apron. She was not a doctor. Her medical knowledge extended only to the countless hours she had spent in the ICU watching nurses tend to her sister. But she knew that pressure was the only thing standing between Leo and death. She tore her apron into long, thick strips. She needed to expose the wound. Grabbing a rusty hunting knife she found on the mantel, she sliced through the remnants of Leo's expensive Italian shirt, peeling the fabric back from his ruined flesh. The bullet had torn through his side, missing the major organs by a fraction of an inch, but it had nicked a vein. She took a deep breath, fighting down the wave of nausea. "I'm sorry," she whispered to his unconscious form. She took the thickest wad of the cotton apron and pressed it directly into the gunshot wound, applying all of her body weight behind her hands. Leo's body arched off the floor violently. A raw, guttural scream tore from his throat, echoing off the wooden walls. His eyes snapped open, wide and wild with excruciating agony. His hands flew up, grabbing Leora's wrists, trying to pry her off him. "Hold still!" Leora shouted, pressing down harder. "You are bleeding out. Stop fighting me." "It burns," he gasped, his fingers digging painfully into her forearms, leaving deep, purple bruises. "Stop!" "I won't stop," she yelled back, her face inches from his. Tears of frustration and fear pricked her eyes. "You owe me, you arrogant bastard! I am freezing, I am terrified, and I am saving your life. So you are going to lay there, and you are going to live." Something in her ferocious outburst seemed to pierce through his haze of pain. Leo's grip on her wrists weakened, his hands falling back to the floor. He squeezed his eyes shut, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched, and he surrendered to the agony. For an hour, Leora did not move. She kept the pressure absolute, her arms trembling, her shoulders burning with lactic acid. In the flickering amber light of the lantern, she watched the rise and fall of his chest. Slowly, agonizingly, the terrifying spurt of dark blood began to slow, the makeshift cotton bandage soaking it up and clotting. When she finally dared to lift her hands, the bleeding had reduced to a sluggish ooze. She quickly wrapped the remaining strips of cloth around his waist, pulling them painfully tight to keep the pressure pad in place. She did the same for the cleaner exit wound on his shoulder. Exhausted, Leora collapsed back against the wall of the cabin, pulling her knees to her chest. She was shivering violently, her wet clothes clinging to her skin. "You're freezing," Leo rasped. His voice was barely a whisper, but his dark eyes were open, watching her from the floor. "I'll live," Leora chattered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Fireplace," he breathed, nodding weakly toward the stone hearth. Behind the logs, hidden cash, blankets, first aid, bourbon. Leora pushed herself up. Sure enough, beneath a loose flagstone in the hearth, she found a waterproof lockbox. Inside were thick wool military blankets, a comprehensive trauma kit, and a flask. She pulled the blankets out, draping two heavily over Leo's shivering form, before wrapping one around her own shoulders. She opened the trauma kit, finding proper gauze and antiseptic, realizing with a bitter irony that the Morettis were prepared for violence, even in their abandoned outbuildings. She uncapped the flask and brought it to Leo's lips. He took a weak sip, coughing as the alcohol burned its way down his throat. She took a long pull herself, the bourbon sending a much-needed trail of liquid fire into her freezing stomach. "Samuel," Leo spoke into the quiet darkness of the cabin, the storm outside finally beginning to break. "He's been my father's right hand for 20 years. He betrayed us to the Rossi Syndicate in Chicago. They want the eastern ports. Taking me out, it cripples my father's succession plan." "Why are you telling me this?" Leora asked, staring into the flame of the lantern. "I'm nobody. I don't want to know your family's secrets. Knowledge in your world gets people killed." Leo turned his head to look at her. The arrogant Mafia prince was gone, stripped bare by the vulnerability of near death. "Because you saved my life, Leora. In my world, blood repays blood. And loyalty is the only currency that matters. You aren't a nobody anymore. You're the girl who pulled a Moretti from the grave." Leora closed her eyes, a deep sense of dread settling over her. She hadn't just saved a man. She had tethered herself to a monster. The hours bled away. The storm exhausted its fury, the howling winds fading into a steady, quiet drizzle. Leora stayed awake, changing Leo's bandages with the supplies from the kit, listening to his breathing stabilize. As the first grey, anemic light of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the cabin walls, a new sound shattered the morning peace. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades chopped through the dense mountain air. The sound grew deafeningly loud, vibrating the floorboards of the cabin, before the engine cut and hovered somewhere very close by. Following it was the crunch of heavy tires on gravel, dogs barking, and men shouting. Leora scrambled to the small, grimy window, wiping away the condensation. Down in the clearing near the edge of the woods, a massive, matte black Sikorsky helicopter had touched down. Surrounding it was an armada of armored SUVs. Dozens of men in black tactical gear, carrying military-grade assault rifles, were swarming the tree line. And walking at the head of the pack, flanked by massive attack dogs, was a man who commanded the very air around him. Dominic Moretti, the Don. He wore a tailored black overcoat, his silver hair immaculate despite the damp air, his face a mask of terrifying, cold fury. He was tracking the blood trail. They were coming straight for the cabin. "Leo," Leora whispered, her voice trembling. "Your father is here." Leo tried to sit up, wincing as the fresh scabs pulled taut. "Open the door, Leora. Stand in the light. Let them see my face before they shoot." Leora moved to the door. Her hands shook as she unlatched the heavy iron deadbolt. She pulled the door open, stepping out onto the decaying porch into the cold, misty dawn. A dozen laser sights instantly painted her chest, little red dots dancing across her bloody, torn uniform. The attack dogs snarled, straining against their heavy leather leashes. Dominic Moretti stopped 10 feet from the porch, his dark eyes, so much like his son's, but infinitely colder, locked onto Leora. He looked at the blood soaking her clothes, her bare, cut foot, the hunting knife still gripped loosely in her right hand. He didn't see a savior. He saw a variable, a witness, a liability. He raised his hand slowly, 2 fingers pointing directly at Leora. "Secure the perimeter," Dominic's voice boomed, deep and gravelly. He looked at the captain of his guard, "and put a bullet in her head. No witnesses." The metallic chorus of a dozen Heckler & Koch HK 416 assault rifles disengaging their safeties was a sound Leora would never forget. It was sharp, clinical, and entirely devoid of mercy. The red laser dots clustered over her heart, a deadly constellation against the blood-soaked fabric of her maid's uniform. She didn't close her eyes. If she was going to die on the rotting porch of an abandoned cabin after surviving the longest night of her life, she was going to look the devil in the face. Dominic Moretti's expression didn't shift. He was a man accustomed to erasing problems, and in his eyes, Leora was nothing more than a variable that couldn't be controlled. The captain of the guard, a massive man with a scarred jawline, rested his finger on the trigger. "Wait." The word was barely a rasp, weak and ragged, but it carried the absolute authority of a bloodline. From the shadows of the cabin interior, Leo Moretti dragged himself into the doorway. He was clinging to the doorframe with a white-knuckled grip, his face the color of ash. The thick wool blanket hung precariously from his shoulders, exposing the blood-soaked makeshift bandages Leora had fashioned. Every breath he took looked like an agonizing chore, but his dark eyes were locked in a lethal stare-down with his father. "Stand them down, Papa," Leo commanded, his voice gaining a fraction of its usual commanding baritone. Dominic's cold facade cracked for a fraction of a second, relief flashing through his eyes before the ruthless Don re-emerged. He didn't lower his hand, but he gave a subtle flick of his wrist. Instantly the rifles were lowered, the red dots vanishing from Leora's chest. The sudden absence of the lasers felt like a physical weight lifting off her ribs. "Leonardo," Dominic stepped forward, his heavy leather boots crunching on the gravel. He ignored Leora entirely, his focus zeroing in on his battered air. "We found the estate breached. 6 of our men dead in the foyer. Samuel is gone." "Samuel opened the gates," Leo choked out, his knees buckling slightly. Leora instinctively reached out, her hand grabbing his uninjured bicep to steady him. Dominic's eyes snapped to her hand, tracking the familiar gesture with predatory calculation. "He sold us out to the Rossi Syndicate. They want the eastern seaboard ports. He sent a hit squad to finish me off." "And the girl?" Dominic's voice was like grinding stones. He looked at Leora as if she were a stain on his shoes. "Why is a maid standing over you with a hunting knife?" "Because she carried me half a mile through a nor'easter, stopped me from bleeding to death on this floor, and kept me breathing until you arrived," Leo stated, his gaze never wavering from his father's. "She knows about Samuel. She knows about the Rossis. She saved my life." Dominic fell silent. The wind whipped his silver hair as he weighed the scales of loyalty and liability. In the Cosa Nostra, a life debt was a sacred, unbreakable bond, but a civilian with intimate knowledge of syndicate warfare was a catastrophic risk. "She has seen too much," Dominic said softly, the danger in his tone unmistakable. "She is a loose end, Leo. You know how we handle loose ends." "She is my loose end," Leo fired back, the effort costing him dearly as he coughed, fresh blood dotting his pale lips. "I gave her my word. She falls under my protection. If you put a bullet in her, you put one in me first." A tense, suffocating silence descended on the clearing. The armed guards shifted uncomfortably, caught in the crossfire of the most powerful men on the East Coast. Leora stood frozen, her heart hammering wildly. She was a pawn on a board she didn't even know how to play, her life hanging on the stubborn pride of a bleeding Mafia prince. Finally, Dominic gave a sharp nod. "Get my son in the chopper, now!" Chaos erupted. 2 paramedics clad in black tactical gear rushed the porch, carrying a collapsible stretcher. They shoved Leora aside with ruthless efficiency, loading Leo onto the canvas and securing him. As they hoisted him up, Leo reached out, his bloody fingers blindly searching until they caught Leora's wrist. "Bring her," Leo ordered the paramedics, his eyes sliding shut. "She doesn't leave my sight." "Move!" One of the guards barked at Leora, shoving a heavy hand against her back. She was propelled forward, her bare, cut foot stinging against the cold ground. She was herded towards the massive Sikorsky S-76 helicopter, the deafening roar of the rotors drowning out her protests. She was shoved into the luxurious leather interior, forced into a seat opposite the stretcher where the medics were already hanging bags of O-negative blood and cutting away the rest of Leo's ruined suit. As the helicopter lifted off, leaving the blood-stained Catskills behind, Leora looked out the window. She had survived the storm, but as she stared at the grim, heavily armed men surrounding her, she realized the terrifying truth. She hadn't escaped the nightmare. She had just been abducted into the heart of it. Leora awoke to the steady, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor and the smell of expensive, sterile linen. She blinked against the harsh sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Her body felt heavy, her mind foggy from sedatives. As her vision cleared, she realized she was not in a hospital. Not a normal one, anyway. The room was massive, decorated in muted greys and brushed steel, looking more like a luxury penthouse suite than a medical facility. Through the glass, she could see the unmistakable skyline of Manhattan, the sprawling green rectangle of Central Park stretching out below. She was in a bed, an IV line taped securely to the back of her hand. Her ruined, bloody uniform was gone, replaced by a pair of incredibly soft silk pajamas. Her right foot had been professionally cleaned, stitched, and bandaged. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the drug-induced haze. "Sophie." Leora ripped the IV out of her hand, ignoring the sudden bead of blood, and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. She had to get to Albany. Sophie's dialysis treatment was scheduled for Tuesday. If Leora missed a shift, they couldn't pay the clinic. "I wouldn't advise sudden movements, Miss Higgins. The sedatives take a while to flush out of the system." Leora jumped, spinning towards the corner of the room. Sitting in a plush leather armchair, a tablet in his hand, was a man she didn't recognize. He was young, maybe 30, wearing a bespoke navy suit that screamed Wall Street. But his posture and the cold, dead-eyed stare belonged entirely to the underworld. "Who are you? Where am I?" Leora demanded, her voice raspy. She grabbed a heavy glass water pitcher from the bedside table, holding it like a weapon. The man didn't flinch. He slowly set the tablet down. "My name is Matteo. You are in a private, secure floor of a medical facility on the Upper East Side, owned by the Moretti family. You have been asleep for 48 hours. 48 hours? Leora dropped the pitcher. It shattered against the hardwood floor, water pooling around her bare feet. "My sister. I have to call my sister. She's at Albany Medical Center. She needs—" "Sophie Higgins," Matteo interrupted smoothly. "Age 19. Diagnosed with stage 4 renal failure. Currently on the transplant list, awaiting a match. Mounting medical debt of approximately $84,000. Leora felt the blood drain from her face. "How do you know that?" The heavy oak door to the suite clicked open before Matteo could answer. Dominic Moretti stepped into the room. In the pristine light of the penthouse, without the rain and the darkness, the Don looked even more imposing. He wore a charcoal Brioni suit, every inch the untouchable billionaire, but the aura of violence clung to him like cheap cologne. "We know everything about you, Leora," Dominic said, walking slowly toward her, his heavy cane tapping against the floorboards. "We know you dropped out of nursing school to care for your sister. We know you work 3 jobs to keep the debt collectors from repossessing your apartment. You are a very hard-working, very desperate young woman." "Don't you dare touch her," Leora hissed, her maternal instinct for her sister overriding her fear of the mob boss. "I saved your son. You owe me." "And I always pay my debts," Dominic replied smoothly. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope, tossing it onto the foot of her bed. "Sophie's medical debt at Albany Med has been paid in full. Her name has been moved to the top of the private donor registry. We have secured the best nephrologists in the state for her care. She will lack for nothing." Leora stared at the envelope. It was everything she had prayed for, everything she had broken her back, scrubbing floors to achieve. It was a miracle wrapped in a nightmare. "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The catch, Miss Higgins, is that you are dead." Leora stumbled back a step. "What?" Dominic gestured to Matteo, who picked up his tablet and swiped the screen, turning it toward Leora. It was a local Albany news report. The headline read, "Tragic highway accident claims life of local woman." Below it was a picture of Leora's rusted Honda Civic, completely unrecognizable, wrapped around a concrete pillar on Interstate 87. "Your car skidded off the road during the storm," Dominic explained, his tone completely detached. "The resulting fire made dental records the only form of identification. A tragic loss." "You faked my death?" Leora whispered, horror choking her. "Why? I told you I wouldn't say anything. I don't care about your Mafia wars." "It isn't about what you care about. It's about leverage." A new voice entered the room. The adjoining door opened, and Leo walked in. He looked infinitely better than he had in the cabin, though he moved with stiff, calculated caution. He was dressed in dark slacks and a black dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, hiding the bandages beneath. He looked at his father, a muscle feathering in his jaw, before turning his dark eyes to Leora. "Samuel knows you were at the estate," Leo said, his voice softer than his father's, but carrying an undercurrent of lethal tension. "He accessed the security logs before he fled. He knows a maid named Leora Higgins was the only one left in the West Wing. He knows you pulled me out." "So?" Leora cried out, feeling like a trapped animal. "So Samuel is a pragmatist," Leo continued, stepping closer to her. "He failed to kill me, which means he is a dead man walking. His only play now is to find out what I know, what my father's retaliation plan is. You are the only person who was with me for 6 hours in that cabin. Samuel believes I might have told you something. If you go back to your apartment in Albany, Samuel's men will take you. They will torture you to find out what you know, and when they realize you know nothing, they will kill you, and they will kill your sister just to tie up the loose end." Leora sank onto the edge of the mattress, her hands covering her face. The gilded cage had slammed shut around her. "Faking your death was the only way to protect Sophie," Leo said, his tone softening slightly. "As long as the world believes you are dead, Samuel has no reason to look for your sister. She is safe." "And what about me?" Leora looked up, tears blurring her vision. "Am I just supposed to stay locked in this tower forever? A ghost?" "You are under my protection," Leo repeated the vow he had made in the woods. "You will stay here, in this penthouse. You will have everything you need. But you cannot leave. You cannot contact your sister. Until I put a bullet in Samuel Reed's skull and dismantle the Rossi syndicate, you belong to the Moretti family." Dominic turned on his heel, his cane clicking against the floor. "See that she gets whatever she needs, Matteo. Leo, we have a war council in an hour." The Don left the room, leaving Leora alone with the heir whose life she had bought with her own freedom. Leo stood there for a long moment, watching the silent tears track down Leora's cheeks. He stepped forward, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out something small and metallic, placing it gently on the bedside table next to the shattered glass. It was a brand-new, high-end radio, identical to the one she had lost in the blood on the marble floor. "I owe you a new radio," Leo said quietly. "And a raise." He turned and walked out, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, locking Leora inside her new, unrecognizable life. 6 weeks. For 42 days, Leora Higgins existed only within the 4,000 square feet of brushed steel, bulletproof glass, and imported leather of the Moretti safe house. To the state of New York, she was ashes scattered in a closed casket funeral paid for by the city. To the world, she was a tragedy swiftly forgotten. But inside the gilded cage perched above Manhattan, she was the syndicate's most heavily guarded secret. Her days were measured in agonizing luxury. Matteo, the dead-eyed enforcer masquerading as a concierge, ensured she had everything from Michelin-starred takeout to cashmere sweaters. He also ensured she never crossed the threshold of the front door. The elevator required a biometric scan that Leora didn't possess. She was a ghost haunting a billionaire's purgatory. The only lifeline she had to her humanity was the sleek black tablet Matteo had quietly slipped onto the kitchen island during week 2. It had one function: a secure, encrypted live feed to a private recovery suite at Albany Medical Center. Leora spent hours sitting on the velvet sofa, her knees pulled to her chest, watching Sophie sleep. The surgery had been a success. The dark, sickly circles under her younger sister's eyes were fading, replaced by a healthy flush that Leora hadn't seen in years. The Morettis had kept their dark promise. Sophie was surrounded by the best medical care money and intimidation could buy. But watching her sister cry over the news of Leora's death had broken something fundamental inside Leora's soul. She had traded her life for Sophie's, but the cost was a suffocating, isolated grief. Her only other company was Leo. The Mafia heir visited the penthouse every third night, usually well past midnight. He was healing, the rigid stiffness in his posture slowly fading as the gunshot wounds knit themselves back together. Their dynamic was a volatile mix of captor and captive, savior and saved. They were bound by the blood spilled on the marble floor of the Blackwood estate, an invisible tether that crackled with unspoken tension. He would arrive smelling of expensive scotch, cold city rain, and the metallic tang of gunpowder, a grim reminder that a war was raging in the streets below to avenge the very wounds she had bandaged. "You're staring at the skyline again." Leo's deep baritone broke the silence of the penthouse one Tuesday night. He dropped a heavy leather dossier onto the glass coffee table and loosened his silk tie. Exhausted. "If you look hard enough, you might burn a hole in the glass." "I'm looking at a world I used to live in," Leora replied, without turning around. She leaned her forehead against the cool pane. "Before I made the mistake of picking you up out of the mud." "You miss scrubbing floors for minimum wage?" Leo walked over, stopping just behind her. The heat radiating from his large frame was palpable. "I miss breathing air that doesn't belong to your father," she shot back, spinning around to face him. Her eyes blazed with a fierce, suppressed anger. "Sophie asked the nurse today if she could visit my grave when she's discharged. Do you know what it's like to watch the person you love most mourn you, while you sit here eating truffles?" Leo's jaw tightened. "It keeps her breathing, Leora." "Samuel's men tortured 3 of my father's lieutenants to death last week, trying to find my location. If they knew you were alive, they would peel Sophie's skin off to get to you. Then find him!" Leora yelled, shoving her hands against his chest. "Find Samuel and end this. You promised me this was temporary." Leo didn't flinch at her strike. He reached up, his large, calloused hands gently wrapping around her wrists, halting her assault. His dark eyes softened, tracing the exhausted lines of her face. "He's a ghost, Leora. He knows our playbook. He knows every safe house, every front, every corrupted cop on our payroll. He's using the Rossi Syndicate's resources to stay completely off the grid. Until he makes a mistake, we are hunting shadows." Leora froze, her pulse hammered against Leo's grip. "He knows every safe house." "Let go of me," she whispered, her mind racing back to the Blackwood estate. She pulled her hands free and paced towards the kitchen island. Samuel lived on the estate, in the carriage house behind the main garage." My men tossed the carriage house the morning after the storm, Leo said, watching her carefully. It was scrubbed clean. He didn't leave a single receipt or hard drive. Your men don't know how to clean, Leora said, turning back to him, her eyes sharp. I do. I was tasked with deep cleaning his quarters once a month. Samuel was paranoid. He had a custom-built humidor in his office, but he didn't smoke cigars. He hated the smell. He complained to Mrs. Gable about the smoke from the Don's office all the time. Leo frowned, crossing the room to stand before her. Why would a man who hates smoke have a humidor? Because it wasn't for cigars, Leora said, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Whenever I dusted it, I noticed the weight was wrong, and the humidity gauge was a dummy. The needle never moved, even in the middle of a humid summer. It's a biometric safe, Leo, built into the woodwork. Leo's entire demeanor shifted. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by the lethal, calculating predator she had dragged through the woods. A localized safe, not on the digital network. If he was brokering a deal with the Rosses, he wouldn't trust it to a cloud server. He'd keep the physical ledgers and burner contacts close. He pulled out his phone, already dialing. Matteo, prep an assault team. We're going back to the Catskills. He looked at Leora, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. You just found our ghost. Wait, Leora grabbed his arm as he turned to leave. If you find his location, if you kill him, the threat is gone. Samuel is dead. The Rosses lose their inside man. Yes, Leo confirmed, his eyes locking onto hers. Then I want a promise, Leora demanded, her voice trembling but resolute. When Samuel is dead, I get my life back. You let me walk out of those elevator doors, and you never come looking for me. Leo stared at her. For a fleeting second, something akin to sorrow flashed in his dark eyes, quickly masked by his usual stoicism. You have my word. The moment Samuel Reed draws his last breath, Leora Higgins comes back from the dead. The humidor contained exactly what Leora said it would. Beneath a false bottom, Leo's men found a heavily encrypted hard drive and a physical ledger detailing Samuel's treason. It took the Moretti family's best hackers less than 12 hours to crack the encryption. Samuel wasn't hiding in a fortress. He was hiding in plain sight, operating out of a decommissioned shipyard in Red Hook, Brooklyn, utilizing the noise and chaos of the industrial waterfront to mask his movements. The raid was scheduled for 2 a.m. Leora had refused to stay in the penthouse. She had fought Leo with a ferocity that surprised even her, threatening to smash every window in the suite until the police arrived if he left her behind. She needed to know it was over. She needed to see the cage door open. Reluctantly, Leo had allowed her into the mobile command center, a heavily armored, matte black communications van parked 3 blocks from the shipyard. She sat surrounded by glowing monitors, wearing a Kevlar vest over a black sweater, a headset strapped over her ears. Matteo sat beside her, a silenced pistol resting casually on his lap, his eyes scanning the thermal imaging cameras. Over the radio frequency, Leora listened to the organized, terrifying symphony of a Mafia hit. Perimeter secured, a gruff voice crackled in her ear. Moving on the main warehouse. Copy that, Leo's voice responded, calm and chillingly detached. Take them alive if you can. Samuel is mine. For 10 minutes, there was only the sound of heavy boots on concrete and the occasional muted thwip of suppressed gunfire as Samuel's perimeter guards were systematically eliminated. Leora's hands shook, gripping the edge of the metal console. This was the brutal reality of the world she had crashed into, a world where human lives were erased in the dark without a second thought. Suddenly the radio feed erupted into chaos. Ambush! Ambush on the 2nd floor! A guard yelled over the comms, followed by the deafening roar of automatic weapons. They knew we were coming. It's a setup! Matteo cursed violently in Italian, his fingers flying across the keyboards, bringing up the internal cameras of the warehouse that their hackers had just breached. The screens illuminated with chaotic night vision footage. "Leo!" Leora screamed into the microphone. "Leo, do you copy?" Static, then a ragged breath. "I copy. They had tripwires on the server room. We're pinned down in the western corridor." Leora stared at the monitors. She watched the thermal signatures of the Rossi Syndicate gunmen swarming the building, but her eyes caught something else. A lone thermal signature moving away from the firefight, slipping down a rusted exterior fire escape towards the docks. He was moving toward a sleek, unlit speedboat tethered to the pier. "Matteo!" Leora pointed frantically at the screen. "Look, someone is running." Matteo leaned in. "That's Samuel. He's abandoning his men. He's making a run for the water." He keyed his radio. "Boss, target is fleeing via the east side fire escape, heading for the docks. I'm cut off," Leo snarled over the heavy gunfire in the background. "I can't break the suppression fire. If he gets on that boat..." "We lose him to international waters." Leora didn't think. She acted on the same desperate, blinding instinct that had forced her to drag a bleeding man through the mud. Samuel was her only ticket to freedom. If he escaped, she remained a ghost forever. Before Matteo could stop her, Leora slammed her hand onto the door release of the van, throwing herself out into the freezing Brooklyn night. "Leora, no!" Matteo shouted, lunging for her, but she was already sprinting down the alleyway, her boots pounding against the wet asphalt. She remembered the layout of the shipyard from the drone footage Matteo had shown her earlier. She cut through a narrow gap between two shipping containers, her lungs burning, the sound of the firefight echoing off the corrugated steel walls around her. She burst out onto the wooden pier just as Samuel Reed reached the end of the dock. He was a tall, gaunt man, carrying a heavy duffel bag, his face illuminated by the moonlight reflecting off the dark water. He threw the bag into the speedboat and turned to untie the mooring line. "Samuel!" Leora screamed, her voice tearing through the salty air. Samuel whipped around, drawing a hand cannon from his shoulder holster with terrifying speed. He aimed it directly at Leora's chest, freezing her in her tracks. He squinted against the gloom, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he recognized the face of the dead woman. "You," Samuel breathed, his gun unwavering. "The maid. Dominic told the families you burned in a car crash." "He lied," Leora panted, stepping forward, the fear completely eclipsed by a blinding rage. "And because of you, I haven't seen my sister in 2 months. I am dead because of you." Samuel let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You're a brave little ghost, but you're unarmed. Did you really run out here just to yell at me before I shoot you?" "I didn't come to shoot you," Leora said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small metallic radio Leo had given her in the penthouse. She held it up, pressing the transmit button. "I came to keep you distracted." Samuel's face drained of color. He spun around towards the shadows of the warehouse. Leo Moretti stepped out from behind a stack of wooden pallets, his tactical rifle raised and locked onto Samuel's chest. He was covered in drywall dust and blood, none of it his own, and his eyes burned with the fury of a betrayed prince. "It's over, Samuel," Leo said, his voice echoing over the slapping waves. Samuel looked from Leo to Leora, realizing he had been outplayed by a billionaire and his housemaid. With a snarl of pure desperation, he raised his weapon toward Leora, deciding to take the Don's prize down with him. He never pulled the trigger. Leo fired twice. The silenced rounds hit Samuel squarely in the chest, the force throwing the traitor backward off the pier. He hit the dark water with a heavy splash, the ripples quickly swallowed by the current of the East River. Silence descended on the docks, save for the distant wail of police sirens responding to the warehouse shootout. Leora stood frozen, staring at the dark water. It was over. The boogeyman was dead. The debt was paid. Leo lowered his rifle, walking slowly down the pier until he stood in front of her. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray tear she hadn't realized she shed. "You shouldn't have run out here," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "You could have been killed." I had to ensure you kept your promise. Leora looked up into his dark eyes. The rain began to fall again, a soft mist that mirrored the night they met. Leo nodded slowly, his hand dropping from her face. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a thick envelope, handing it to her. New passport, social security card, a bank account routing number with enough money to buy a house in a quiet suburb, far away from New York. Your sister is being discharged tomorrow. You are a free woman, Leora Higgins. Leora took the envelope. It felt incredibly heavy. This was everything she had fought for. She could walk away right now, vanish into a comfortable, safe, mundane life. She would never have to scrub another floor or look over her shoulder again. She looked at Leo. She saw the violence in him, the dark world he ruled, the blood that would forever stain his hands. But she also saw the man who had protected her, the man who had given her sister a future, the man whose heart beat steadily beneath her hands on the floor of a ruined cabin. Leora looked down at the envelope, then back up at the Mafia prince. Slowly, deliberately, she tore the envelope in half, letting the pieces flutter out of her hands and into the dark water below. Leo's eyes widened in genuine shock. "What are you doing? I gave you an out." "I know," Leora said, stepping closer to him, the distance between them vanishing. "But I don't want to be a ghost anymore, and I don't want to be a maid. I saved your life, Leo Moretti, which means it belongs to me now." A slow, devastating smirk spread across Leo's face, a mixture of pure danger and profound reverence. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. "You are an incredibly dangerous woman, Leora." "You have no idea," she whispered back. The storm that ravaged the Catskills had washed away Leora Higgins's old life, but it hadn't destroyed her. It had forged her. What began as an act of desperate humanity, a maid dragging a bleeding monster from the mud, evolved into a dangerous game of survival, loyalty, and undeniable power. Leora didn't just survive the underworld. She learned to navigate its treacherous currents. She chose not to walk away from the darkness, but to stand beside the man who ruled it, not as a captive, but as an equal. The invisibility of her past was gone forever. She was no longer just the girl who cleaned the blood off the marble. She was the woman who decided whose blood would be spilled.